So in the last couple of talks we were looking at sources of architectural form, in particular in that case, looking at numbers, mathematics, and geometry as they provoke architectural form. In the next couple of talks we're going to be looking at a different source, still sources of architectural form, but a completely different source in nature and biology and organisms as they've inspired architectural form. So there are, I think, probably four provocations or reasons why we gravitate toward organic or natural sources of form. For one thing, many buildings are made out of natural materials. So if we're making a building out of wood or we're making it out of stone, there is some provocation to simply use the shapes and forms of that wood and that stone as a provocation for making the building. So it becomes very intrinsically natural and organic. A second reason is that there are just forces of nature, wind, rain, gravity, that act on buildings, and sometimes they act in ways that create these kind of natural and organic forms in the building. Then a third reason is we as human beings are organic forms. And as we interact with buildings, as we make buildings that accommodate our bodies and the shape of our bodies, they would naturally become organic in that way. So our physiognomy is a third reason why this would make sense. And then a fourth and final reason is that, the way we move is a kind of organic or dynamic way of moving. We don't move in right angles, well, maybe military, but beyond that, not really. So our activities, our behavior, our movement tends to generate maybe more organic forms as well. So at the beginning here, we're going to be looking at how materials and how forces of nature and how human physiognomy and human movement in a very natural way create architecture that is based very solidly in nature and biology and organisms. So let's start with a very interesting ensemble of, I guess what you would call buildings, that are rock-cut houses in the Cappadocia region in the center of Turkey. This is on the freaking middle of nowhere in central Turkey. It's an ancient part of the world, kind of a cradle of civilization, but these days sparsely populated and actually kind of dangerous in the eastern and central part of Turkey politically more recently. But this is an area which has been inhabited continuously since way before biblical times. The Hittites were an early empire that was based in the center of Turkey. And it's a very interesting topography here. These are a range of hills that you can see where there is a very soft stone that's in this region called tufa stone. And it's sufficiently soft that you can take a spoon and you can actually carve away at the stone very easily. And so nature has kind of carved away with the way water has run over these hills and the way wind has buffeted those hills and created these very interesting and quite beautiful organic forms in the landscape. And then people have come back and begun to inhabit those spaces and cut houses into this soft tufa stone and to make an inhabitation out of that area as well. So it is shaped in part by the material, which is this very soft stone. It's shaped in part by the natural forces of weathering and rain and water as it shapes those landscape forms. And then it also is being shaped by the path of human movement as it goes through the homes and through the village that's cut into the side of the hill here. And then it's also shaped by human physiognomy. These are little sleeping niches where you can see that when I sit up in bed, I need a little more height. When I lie down, I need less height. And you can kind of see that motion of getting in and out of bed there, shaping that just by the dimension and the size and the shape and the movement of our bodies. So in a very authentic, very unpretentious way, these people have been making their houses in the way that nature seems to imply is a good way to do it. On completely the other side of the world, it's interesting to see a different place and a different culture where their materials and their climate and their landscape generates architectural form from nature, but in a completely different way. This is in Bangkok, Thailand. Bangkok historically has been an absolutely beautiful city. It was primarily on waterways. It was often called the Venice of the East. We might easily have called Venice the Bangkok of the West. It's an ancient city where waterways were the primary way that people got around in the city, just as the canals are in Venice. It also is a very tropical climate. Could not be more different from the kind of desert climate that we were seeing in central Turkey. But you can see in this case them using materials, using sort of natural forces, using human physiognomy and human movement to create architectural forms in the same way. And maybe we could start with the most kind of tiny architectural form, which are these hats that are ancient design of a hat in this part of the world. This is what's called a knob, G-N-O-B. And it is meant to make a little architectural shelter for the people in a climate that's got very intense sun and very heavy rains. So in terms of materials, they're using fibers that they can get out of their palm trees here, and they're weaving them together to make this kind of supple mat of woven fiber. That then makes this kind of organic shape there. They're actually elevating it above their head. So there's a band, and then this straw element is a little higher. So the breeze can come through and they don't get sweaty around their head. So it's looking at natural forces of breezes. It's looking at how you keep the rain off of them by shedding the water this way, keeping the sun off your shoulders by the dimension of that, reflecting the human body, the shape of the head. All of those elements are going into creating this knob, this little bit of shelter for the people. And it's exactly those same kinds of forces that are shaping their boats, shaping their homes. Many of their homes are in houseboats, shaping their shops. Many of their shops are in these boats that go along the waterways. And it's the hydrodynamics of moving through the water that's shaping the form of those elements we see here. It's keeping the rain off and the sun off, that's shaping the elements here. It's the materials of those reeds or the wood that is shaping those architectural elements there. So again, very good reasons why these organic forms are being generated. In the case of their royal palace and their more prestigious buildings, again, it's often coming from more organic sources of form. These spiky little interesting things that you see right there, those actually come from, in some ways, the human body. There are dances that are very common in Thailand, very beautiful dances that women do. And they arch their fingers back far farther than I can arch mine, bend them way back. They have super long fingernails. And there's this very graceful movement in the dance that then has been translated into these shapes and forms of ornament in their more spectacular public buildings. So again, it's drawing on organic sources of architectural form. Even in the religious structures, this is a great Wat, the Wat Arun, which is a Buddhist kind of temple. It doesn't have an interior, it's a kind of precinct with this Wat in the center of it. Again, it's being shaped by exactly the things we've been talking about. It's an earthen structure made of masonry. That shape with it spindly and tall, small at the top, getting larger, 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 larger as it goes toward the ground. It's simply the way that earth or masonry wants to carry gravity loads down into the ground. You can in fact find ant mounds all over in Thailand that are this kind of shape, where it's thin at the top and gets thicker, thicker, thicker as it goes down. So it's generated by materials. It's also generated by human movement. Part of the Buddhist ritual is circumambulation. So people are doing their prayers. They're going around in a circle like that. They're ringing bells and saying prayers. And that's generating the form of the base of the building here. And then there are, even within the ornament of these temples, you can see human forms, you can see vegetative forms, organic sources of form continually through that. So many cultures, many different parts of the world, you can see these roots in organic sources of form. Now, today we're going to really be looking at a particular culture in France in the 19th century that got very interested in nature and began a movement that then proffered a lot of design and buildings that take organic sources of form very seriously. So these artists in the Barbizon School were interested in finding a place where they could get to the core, the roots of what art might be. And they left Paris, went out to this little town of Barbizon near the Fontainebleau forest, and they began to paint the trees and the rocks and the ducks and the cows and the peasants. And they didn't paint in their studios. They painted instead in what they called plein air. But they take their canvases out to the outdoors and they paint in nature. And the idea was to try to get a more authentic expression of what art might be. Find an inspiration in what is timeless and amazing in nature. So as they began to develop that way of painting, out of that came the Impressionist school of art in French art. And then as that developed even further into the next stage of development in art, which was really a little more analytical of the natural forms and forces they were seeing. So rather than just literally painting the trees and the rocks and the ducks, instead they're beginning to look and see what are qualities of light and color and shape that I can see in nature that inspires my painting. So on the left we see a painting called Starry Night by Edvard Munch. He's a great Norwegian painter, and he's looking at the shapes and forms of these fjords and mountains and waterways as they intersect with each other, looking at the colors of the sky and of the sea and of the reflections. He's not so interested in depicting that literally as in finding shapes and colors that are creating a painting out of qualities that are in nature. Very much the same thing is happening with Henri Rousseau here in his painting called The Dream of 1910. And this guy has gone not just to Barbizon outside of Paris, he goes way to the other side of the world, to the South Pacific, and he's looking at very native cultures there and the environments they live in. And he's looking kind of analytically and seeing the shape of the vegetation and the shape of the snake and the shape of her braid and the shape of her long fingers and toes, those elongated shapes that he's seeing in different parts of nature, and analyzing that as a kind of beautiful form to put together. Similarly, the roundness of her breast, the roundness of the fruits up here, the roundness of the eyes of the tigers there, all of those, the roundness of the moon, all of that being what in nature are shapes and forms and colors and qualities that I can incorporate in my painting. That then led to a whole kind of revolution in art and design and architecture that began to look at more organic forms. So in furniture making, you began to see people looking at the shapes of legs of animals and insects and how that might create graceful forms in the leg of a table. Or they begin to look again, as we were talking about a minute ago, at what are the materials I'm making this out of? I'm making out of wood, and wood has a kind of grain to it. And, what is this about at this moment? That's about a pull. It's kind of stretching away from that. And how can that generate a kind of dynamic form that has to do with pulling that wood drawer open? That's incredibly explicit in this piece right here, where we can see the grain of the wood becoming the handle. And you can almost see that handle stretching the wood as it pulls loose from it, and very much taking the shape of your hand as you interact with it. So it is the forces and the material and the human physiognomy all joining together to make that organic form. And you get even people like René Lalique, who's designing jewelry, and it's coming from natural forms like dragonflies and insects and things that seem very beautiful. How can we translate those qualities into design? I love this one on the left, where it's a prickly pear, where the illumination is coming from the blooms of the prickly pear, but all of the shapes and forms are coming out of observations of qualities in nature that are graceful and beautiful and appropriate to appropriate for this reason. So then you see architects beginning to do the same thing. How can we look at nature, and how can we find forms that inspire what we do? Very interesting architect in Scotland, Charles Rennie Mackintosh. He was practicing in Glasgow. He was a fantastic draftsman, did beautiful watercolors. He was very interested in lilies in particular. And he actually ended up doing illustrations for botanical books because he was so precise at his analysis of these lilies, their pistils and stamen and petals, and analyzing them perfectly, but really looking for the graceful and beautiful forms within the lilies. And then that becomes the inspiration for this wallpaper that he designed in a tea room in Glasgow, where he's getting those sinuous linear forms, those beautiful lyrical forms from his study of the lilies. And those also inspired his design for flatware here, these attenuated, thin, delicate forms of the fork and spoon, furniture that he designed that almost seemed to have a kind of blossom, and then these very delicate members within them. All of those, looking at nature, understanding nature, finding those inspirations for form. Someone very contemporary with Charles Rennie Mackintosh, but in France, a guy named Hector Guimard. Guimard designed all of the stations for the Paris Metro. They're just installing the subway in Paris for the first time. And he's designing these moments where you enter the station. And sometimes you're entering it, say, in a park here, and he's very much using the quality of leaves and veins in leaves, and maybe even spider webs and dragonfly wings, but making these delicate organic forms that take you into the subway. And even in an urban case, using almost like it's a flower coming up and blooming, and that becomes the light for the metro. All of the handrails, more like vegetative forms. But all of these architects that are now beginning to be grouped together and called Art Nouveau painting, Art Nouveau furniture, Art Nouveau jewelry, Art Nouveau architecture, It means literally in French, new art. But instead of finding art in the traditional forms, instead they're inventing new art that they're drawing from natural sources and forms. Guimard does many, he's a very prolific architect. He does many, many buildings in the 16th arrondissement in Paris. And he starts maybe with a kind of traditional arch that you see here, but now just shaping it a little more organically. Inside, though, is a gate that we're seeing right here. It's made out of metal. That metal starts molten. It can be liquid. There's no reason why it has to take rectilinear forms. So he's letting you see the fluidity of the metal, and he's sort of discussing the operation of that gate opening up. But again, more natural and organic sources of the form. And then he begins to play around much more with the stone and with the entrances to buildings and with the windows, and creating these softer forms out of stone that seem maybe a little more almost like those houses we saw in Cappadocia, where they're hollowing out and moving into the building. Guimard explores rough stone like he finds it in the ground. He explores sort of organic shapes and forms. He even gets to a certain point where he's interested in making a whole building, inside, outside, all of the rooms more organic. Why do we have rectilinear rooms? When we're sweeping up a stair like that, why shouldn't it be fluid? When we're gathering around a table, why shouldn't it be more like that gathering action? Why would we have buildings so rigid like we make them? Why wouldn't they be more organic? And this was really the beginning of opening up nature, biology, and organisms as a really fundamental source for architectural form. In the next talk, we'll see where that went from there.